never get my money back. I'm only interested in putting Rovers where they should be. I mean, they're one of the founder members and we want them right back on top.
Over 50 teams have participated in the Premier League since its inception, yet only 7 have lifted the coveted trophy. These days, it's hard to imagine that anyone other than a pool of 3, maybe 4 clubs will win it in the foreseeable future. But that wasn't the case right at the inception of the league. Back then, it was a kind of free-for-all. Teams were finding their footing in the midst of a wave of TV and commercial upticks. Sir Alex Ferguson seemed to be the only one that had the game all figured out. The likes of Aston Villa, Leeds, Newcastle, Queen's Park Rangers, and more all had their time at the pinnacle of the table. But almost none of them could keep the consistency running season by season. Man City were fighting for their lives in the relegation zone more often than not. It was a completely different period in time. But there was one club that I've yet to mention amongst all these that actually has something to show for this wild west period of time that isn't just folklore. A team that actually managed to get their hands on the trophy. Yet, somehow, this same team faded away into obscurity almost immediately. This team is Blackburn Rovers. A curious case, a team that many will tell you bought their success, yet isn't remembered in the same way that Chelsea and Man City are. A team that housed the greatest striker in English football history at the peak of his powers, an owner that had a vision and actually made it happen, and the only town club to have won a Premier League title. Today, we recount the story of Blackburn Rovers, the Premier League champions that disrupted the status quo only to never be seen again. Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to the channel. Feel free to subscribe if you haven't, or, don't. From the outside looking in, the Lancashire Town Club aren't exactly what we would associate with Premier League champions. They finished the 23-24 football season only 3 points above relegation in the Championship. If you were to speak to anyone that started watching the Premier League recently, they may find it hard to believe that a team that hasn't even been in the league for over a decade was once the most feared team in the country. Not just feared for what they did on the pitch, but for the threat they posed to the status quo. However, I'm getting ahead of myself. To really understand where this club came from and how they managed to shock the world in the way that they did, we have to go back to the 19th century. Blackburn Rovers are a fascinating and storied football club. One might even consider them as one of the first giants in the game of English football, as they were successful almost immediately upon formation. Formed in 1875, Blackburn Rovers, like several business endeavors, started off as the vision of 2 mates, John Lewis and Arthur Constantine. This right here is John Lewis. As expected, his mustache is commendable. The two called a town meeting where the agenda was the formation of a club that played football under association rules, and on the 18th of December 1875, the first official Blackburn Rovers matchup was played. They faced some competition at the time for the crown of Team of the Town, as there were over a dozen other clubs in existence in Blackburn, one of which was the now long defunct club Blackburn Olympic FC. I mention them because this team may very well be one of the most significant northern teams in all of England, maybe one of the most significant teams across the country. Founded 3 years after Rovers in 1878, Olympic were very much a working man's club, with all of its players being manual laborers or factory workers. Most of the quote-unquote true footballing talent lay in the south of England at the time. Something to understand is that in the early days, football wasn't really a working man's sport, it was for the upper class. And at the time, in the 1800s at least, football was entirely amateur. About all the southern teams consisted of upper class players from prestigious schools and backgrounds, so they had the necessary training, which may explain why the FA Cup went south every year, up until 1883, that is. Blackburn Olympic defeated the Old Etonians by 2-1 in the 1882-83 FA Cup final, and the Olympic captain, Albert Warburton, puffed his chest out to the press and reportedly said that the cup is very welcome to Lancashire, it'll have a good home, and it'll never go back to London. The boys down in London were not happy about this, mostly because they were sure that the working class players were receiving payments by the club to train up to that level and play, which of course was illegal, even though most teams were suspected of doing this. As far as Olympic was concerned, nothing was proven at the time. It got to the point where so many clubs, mainly Northern, were openly signing players on side jobs for the club. Some real, some not so much. What I'm trying to say is that these players weren't signed as players. Dishwashers or groundskeepers or something of the sort. Blackburn Rovers, close neighbours of Olympic, were closer to a middle-class club and were one such club that was highly suspected of paying their players, a lot of them Scottish. And depending on who you ask, it seems as though the Scottish influence of passing over brute strength is what set them apart from the rest of the English teams. But you didn't hear this from me. Blackburn Rovers won the FA Cup 3 seasons in a row from 1883 to 1886, so they clearly had an edge. In any case, the FA were faced with the decision of either letting the sport become professional or having what were at that point the best teams in the country leave and form their own association. They chose the former. And as for Blackburn Olympic, they added a lot of kindling to the fire that eventually led to the legalization of players getting paid to play. However, they themselves found it hard to find sponsors when it happened. Players across town at Rovers were earning 4 to 5 times more than them, so naturally many players jumped ship. And by 1988, when the first division was born, only one team from each town was permitted to join the league. Rovers got in and Olympic folded. Truly, I didn't mean to go into this much detail about a team not named Blackburn Rovers in a Blackburn Rovers video, but here we are. Moving along. Along with their FA Cup triple in the early 1880s, Blackburn Rovers added 2 more FA Cup titles to their trophy cabinet in both 1890 and 1891, meaning that they had won the country's premier football competition 5 times, more than anyone else. Well, bar Wanderers FC, who dissolved in 1887. And no one has won 3 in a row since they did it. They officially moved into Ewood Park in 1890, and this has been their home ever since. Although you'd have to imagine that it was nothing more than a patch of grass at the time. Big bucks were spent to renovate it in 1905 to a respectable state, £1,680. That's a lot of change. Rovers were taken very seriously. And even though the turn of the century meant that they saw a dip in their FA Cup performances, they remained in the top division indefinitely. While the likes of Preston, Sunderland and Sheffield Wednesday were winning the league one year and getting relegated the next, Rovers were comfortably mid-table throughout. The only other team with as much staying power as them was Aston Villa. Rovers would go on to claim their first league title soon after though, one in 1912 and another one in 1914, followed by a 6th FA Cup win. Unfortunately, their luck ran out in 1936, relegation for the first time in their history. And as if the scriptwriters in a Bayer Leverkusen match were around back in 1936, so were Aston Villa. As of these 2 teams going down, every founding member of the league had now faced the drop. Rovers fought their way back only 2 seasons later to gain promotion in 1939 though. Football took a back seat thanks to global politics around this time. But if we jump forward about a decade, football was so back. However, Blackburn were back to the drawing board. Another relegation in 1948. Yet this relegation was different. It marked the beginning of a pretty notable tradition, the burial of the coffin. And before you ask, yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. This is a tradition shared by both Blackburn Rovers and Preston North End supporters. Whenever one of these teams is relegated, a physical coffin representing the team is buried. Back then, the coffin was filled with vegetables to represent the players, but now it's a children's doll because vegetables rot. The burial was originally conducted in Bamber Bridge, Preston, but due to fears of public disorder, the parades have since been held in the respective towns of each team. In 2011, when Preston North End were relegated from the Championship to League One, the chairman of the Burial Organising Committee, Mick Higgins, said, "We hope many people get involved and donate to the great cause that the committee have chosen and celebrate a family fun day, a tradition that we don't want to let die." And for good reason too. The whole premise is that when promotion is achieved, the coffin is dug up and its contents, which in this case would be the team, are risen once again. I mean, it's not like most people need a reason to party, plus the donations go to charity. Despite the fact that it's a funeral, It's clearly not much of a dreary affair. I quite like the idea, if I'm honest with you. And party is exactly what the fans of this club did 10 years later when they were promoted back up to the First Division in 1958. During their time back up in the top division, they returned to their position around the mid-table range. There were some bright sparks though. In 1960, Blackburn reached the FA Cup final, but they lost 3-0 to Wolves. In 1963, they were top of the table on Boxing Day, but they couldn't keep up the performances and eventually finished the season in 7th place. They were relegated 2 years later, and then again a further 4 years later. In fact, until the late 80s, there was not much other than disappointment. Rovers failed to establish a grip on top-flight football, or even second division football for that matter. They needed help. They needed someone special to step up and turn them into the team that they were always meant to be. We're now in the 1980s. As Blackburn were toiling in obscurity, frustrations among the town and the support had begun to bubble up to the surface in a very big way. Once a powerhouse in English football, now nothing but an afterthought in the grand scheme of things. Lucky for them, there was one man that had seen enough. A man that wanted nothing but to see his boyhood club succeed and take their rightful place at the top of the pile. That man was Jack Walker. Industrial magnate, serial entrepreneur, born in Blackburn, Rovers supporter. Walker was born in 1929 as one of 3 children. School wasn't exactly his thing, as he left formal education at the age of 14. He began working as a sheet metal worker and a conscripted craftsman with the military. When he was about 22 years old in 1951, his father passed on and him and his siblings were tasked with taking over the family business. At the time, this family business was simply just a small scrap metal business in the back streets of Blackburn. Reportedly, in 1956, the business was operating at a revenue of £46,000 per year. Fast forward to 1988, and the business was turning over £48 million per year. Walker Steel was a runaway success, and so Walker did what many would do later in life after building the business up to such a powerhouse. He sold it for roughly £360 million in 1990. At this point, Walker was estimated to have amassed a fortune of about £600 million, which placed him as the 21st richest man in all of Britain. It's quite the story. Naturally, when you reach this kind of success in life, one of your first instincts is what? I'll give you a couple of seconds. That's right. Paying as little tax as possible. Walker moved to the Channel Islands, more specifically Jersey, way back in the 70s. When he arrived there, he almost immediately took an interest in the local football scene. This was apparently thanks to his postman talking his ear off about the Jersey League champions, First Tower United. Walker became very intertwined with the club from then on. He had his airline company, Jersey European Airways, sponsor the Jersey Football Club and the Jersey Rugby Club. He became friends with the club officials and league officials, funding the training grounds for the club, hosting lavish parties for those involved with the club after match days. He sometimes even invited the teams that they were playing against on the day to those parties. I get just as much joy from First Tower as I do from watching Rovers. I'm just a dedicated supporter. I've traveled to matches with them on the coach when the windows have been frozen outside and in. I come to every game and reserve games. I just love it. I even get drunk with them. From these words by the man himself, it's obvious to all that he was just a guy with insane business acumen that just so happened to be a huge football nerd. He's a very down-to-earth man who loves nothing better than having a drink and a chip butty with the boys after the game. You would never know he had so much money. Colin Jones, the secretary of First Tower United, once said this about the man, which is sweet. But, of course, Walker did have money. Lots of it. And I suspect that he always had a plan for it. A plan that would shake things up in a very big way up north.
I now have the time to do what I always wanted to do and be involved in Blackburn Rovers.
As we've already mentioned, Jack Walker was a lifelong Blackburn Rovers fan. He had been in attendance for several matches in his youth and several more as he began to build his enormous fortune. So it should come as no surprise that he had helped Blackburn out many times before having any official involvement with the club. For example, in 1988, Walker donated construction materials to the club for the new Riverside stand at Ewood Park. Now, that That is official knowledge, but it's also widely believed that he was behind the signings of Ozzy Ardiles and Steve Archibald the year before, both highly renowned players that may have been late in their careers, 31 and 35 respectively, but were of a high enough profile that you wouldn't think that they'd go to second division side Blackburn. 3 years in a row, Blackburn finished in 5th in the second division between 1988 and 1990. Each time they qualified for the playoffs, but never did enough to make it through. By early 1990, Walker had made his move official and was the new owner of Blackburn Rovers. And he had big plans, alright. Bear in mind that at this point, when it came to football, Walker was relatively unknown, outside of Blackburn, that is, and he preferred it that way. Him taking over the club never made national news immediately. However, what did make national news was when Rovers, a second division side, somehow managed to persuade Kenny Dalglish, King Kenny Dalglish, to join them as their manager. Now, Kenny Dalglish is not only Scotland's greatest player of all time, but also one of Liverpool's greatest players and then coaches. He won 4 Scottish Premier Divisions with Celtic and 6 First Divisions and 3 European Cups with Liverpool as a player. As a manager, he won a further 3 First Divisions with Liverpool, with the most recent one being about 15 months before he joined Blackburn. It's almost like Jurgen Klopp going to manage Blackburn right now. This was huge. Another reason that this made news was that Dalglish had resigned as Liverpool manager in February of 1991, citing stress from the job and the Hillsborough disaster forever at the forefront of his mind. When he resigned, Liverpool were 3 points ahead at the top of the table. They were second by the end of the season. Most people weren't too upset by his resignation, all things considered, given the context. However, when he returned to management only 8 months later with Moneybag's second division Blackburn Rovers, many felt a certain way about it. Nonetheless, this was a huge deal for Blackburn. People were paying attention, and more importantly, players were paying attention. In his first year in charge, Blackburn finished in 6th, just enough to qualify for the playoffs, and they broke their duck, making it to the Premier League for its inaugural season. This was thanks to them defeating Leicester City in the playoffs. Now in the country's Premier Division, there was a lot of work to be done, and the work was done very well, as evidenced by Blackburn Rovers finishing 4th in their first year back. The next year, they came 2nd. At the end of the previous season, Blackburn were rocking a second division squad, but they had European ambitions. Cash needed to be splashed. Ewood Park was upgraded to the cost of roughly £20 million, extending its capacity to around 30,000 people. Tim Flowers, the most expensive goalkeeper in England, Henning Berg, Colin Hendry, Kevin Gallagher, Ian Pearce, David Batty, Paul Warhurst, Graham Lasso, Stuart Ripley, Tim Sherwood and Jason Wilcox were amongst the most prominent players that were brought in for the project in the 4 years between 1991 and 1994. Many made up the core of the squad. Cumulatively, the signings in this period accounted for £25 million. And remember, this was before the boom in TV revenue. Even though a quarter of a Caicedo may sound like it's not that much in today's day and age, back then, it very much was. The crown jewels amongst the lot were Alan Shearer and Chris Sutton. Both players broke the British transfer record when they transferred over to Blackburn Rovers. £3.6 million and £5 million. And for good reason too. Chris Sutton was flying high with Norwich City when he moved over to Rovers in '94. 25 goals in the league with the Canaries. Alan Shearer, in particular, was a real coup. The Geordie-born 22-year-old was tearing it up with Southampton. 13 goals with them in the league and an England call-up. And his game was about so much more than goal scoring. He was a player's player, strong on both feet and not shy of dropping deep thanks to his upbringing as a midfielder. When the 1991-92 season was coming to a close, Ian Branford labelled himself as the most popular manager in English football, as his phone wouldn't stop ringing with clubs trying to pry Shearer from him. Manchester United, Liverpool, Newcastle, and more. They all wanted a piece of him. But it was Jack Walker who managed to convince him to join. Perhaps it was the allure of this exciting new project. Perhaps it was the £10,000 that he was on when he signed, the highest in the league. Who knows? But according to Mark Adkins, who was at the club since before the Walker takeover, the defining factor in this decision was King Kenny. You see, Dalglish was one of Shearer's biggest heroes. I'm sure the 10k was nice too. By very many accounts, Kenny Dalglish was the ultimate key that made everything come together and make all of this possible. At the same time though, when we're talking about the overarching picture, and while we're on the topic of splashing cash, this seems as good a time as ever to bring up the age-old argument of comparative spend. Blackburn Rovers spent a lot of money on football players, sure, but most of it went towards Shearer, Sutton and Flowers. Blackburn's first team squad by 1995 cost them just shy of £15 million. The three I just mentioned accounted for about 11 million of that. Liverpool was likely a little irritated that their hyper-successful former manager was now competing with them on the transfer market. And I only mention Liverpool here to point out the fact that Blackburn weren't the only team that was spending big. Manchester United squad in 1995 cost them about £19 million. Newcastle had paid about £2 million for a 21-year-old Andy Cole and £2.7 million for Darren Peacock in 94. Carlton Palmer went to Leeds for £2.6 million in 94. And Phil Babb and John Scales went to Liverpool for $3.6 million each in the same year. Now, for Rovers, I also acknowledge that we have the fee of Dalglish, which has never been revealed, but which you'd imagine was massive. And of course, we have a slurry of other players that came in for high fees, but never exactly made it at Blackburn. All I'm trying to say is that the notion that Blackburn were outspending everyone isn't exactly true. And from the way many former players speak, it seems as though it was only the Shearers and Suttons of the world that were on the mega salaries. Look, I'm not trying to say Blackburn were innocent of enticing through large sums of cash. I'm just saying that the way they've been depicted as the original Chelsea or Man City in the decades since doesn't seem to be a representation of the truth. Plus, all of Walker's money came from Walker Steel. It was locally sourced and traceable. Yes, Blackburn were, in a sense, new money, but the circumstances had to, at the very least, count for something. Anyway, that's enough of an off-field rant, back to actual football. As I said, Blackburn Rovers had fought their way up to the Premier League and were officially the second best team in the land by 1994. From 19th in the second division to this in only 3 years is unthinkable, and they owed much of it to a winning formula put into place by their legendary manager. In the 94-95 season, this is what we were dealing with. Rovers lined up in a traditional 4-4-2, as one would expect from a Premier League side at the time. Up top were Shearer and Sutton, who were very much the most important players on the team. The intention was to involve them in as much of the game as possible. Shearer, in particular. The midfield of Tim Sherwood and Mark Atkins got their heads up whenever possible. The defense of Pearce and Hendry went long whenever they could, and the outside players of Lasso, Berg, Wilcox and Ripley were fed frequently, after which they would aim missiles into the box at every opportunity. Sutton was big, physical, and could bring a ball down, play with his back to goal, bring the midfield and wide players up the pitch, and play it off with Shearer. Shearer was highly skilled and had very few weaknesses this season, if any, which is wild considering that he was coming off an ACL tear from a few seasons ago. He still had his pace, and he could score from virtually any situation. Get tight to him, he shrugs you off. Give him a bit of space, he leaves you in the dust, and the ball almost always ends up in the goal. The 92-93 season was the year that Shearer snapped his ACL. He missed half of Rovers games that year because of it. All the same, he scored 16 goals in the 21 games that he played in. In 93-94, back to full fitness, he scored 31 in 40. Many people never come back from ACL injuries, especially 30 years ago. There's a reason he's still considered the greatest pure striker the league has ever seen. I personally only caught his later years at Newcastle, and with virtually no knees and no pace, he was still the man. Anyway, that's not to say that this team was a one-trick pony or anything. There was real experience and talent across the pitch. Tim Sherwood, for example, was a real star in the middle. Jack Walker was famously offered the opportunity to sign Zinedine Zidane in 1996 for £1.2 million when he was still at Bordeaux. And you want to know what his response was? Why would I want to buy Zidane when we have Tim Sherwood? Newcastle also turned down the opportunity to sign him for the same fee, citing that he was not good enough for English football. He went to Juventus that same year and won the Ballon d'Or 2 years later. No comment. But all joking aside, what that quote tells us is that he had confidence in his players. And why wouldn't he? Atkins and Sherwood were dogs. They would hound the opposition and wouldn't stop until possession was retained. As I said, Shearer was such a threat in large part due to his versatility. He would drop into the midfield to create 3 in the middle, but would usually take 1 or 2 defenders with him. Ripley, Sutton, and Wilcox knew exactly what to do next. Lesseau was great at driving into the midfield too. This team knew how to progress the ball. Blackburn were very much expected to challenge for the title in 1994. Anything but would spell embarrassment on the part of Jack Walker, Dalglish, and all the millions that had been spent. However, they needed to be more than just good if they wanted to pose a threat to the great Manchester United. United were relentless at this point. They were the only club to have won the Premier League up to then after winning 2 in a row. Giggs, Keane, Cole, Cantona, Dennis Irwin.
Dennis Irwin was, my God, Dennis. Imagine if Dennis was playing now. And always fit.
This team was the real deal, and they were very well drilled. Blackburn were going to have to come up with something special here. They didn't start off perfectly, as Southampton held them to a 1-1 draw. Arsenal held them at Highbury too. In fact, they only managed 6 wins in their first 11 games. The 11th defeat was at the hands of Manchester United, 4-2 at Ewood Park. Rovers led this game twice, but couldn't hold on to their leads. To be fair, in this game, Henning Berg was sent off for fouling Lee Sharp before Eric Cantona made it 1-1. Not only was this an incorrect call as Berg got the ball, but he was sent off, compounding Rovers' misery. They were doomed in that game from that moment on. But after that, they went through the period that would ultimately prove pivotal in the race. 12 games in a row unbeaten. Only 1 draw in that time frame, keeping them at the top. Saying Shearer was on fire in this season would be a monumental understatement. With 34 goals in 42 games, he equaled the all-time record for most goals scored in a single Premier League season. With 47 goals and assists, he contributed to 59% of Blackburn Rovers' goals that season. I drew attention to Alan Shearer and Chris Sutton earlier for a reason, because combined, they scored 49 goals this season, 61% of all goals scored by the club in the league. They were animals. The 12-game unbeaten streak was brought to a close by none other than Manchester United, 1-0, courtesy of Eric Cantona. Now, little did we all know that Cantona would take points away from Blackburn on that day, but he would also go on to virtually give them the league about 3 days later. All I'm saying is that you don't want to be sitting pitch side at Selhurst Park when Eric Cantona comes to town. The famous karate kick. After getting sent off for a foul against Crystal Palace as he was walking off the pitch, he started receiving abuse by the home support. One man in particular is said to have stated that Cantona should f*** off back to France. Cantona literally said, say less, launched a flying kick and followed it up with a devastating punch combo. He was banned for 8 months from all football activity in all leagues, meaning leaving England wouldn't help, plus he was fined £30,000 all in all. He was Manchester United's talisman at the time, their driving force, and undoubtedly had the biggest presence amongst all men on the pitch whenever he was on it. His loss put a monumental dent in United's title charge. Over 2 decades later, in 2021, when promoting his short film, The United Way, he simply said, "I have one regret. I would have loved to kick him even harder." Fair enough. United's season certainly began losing gas from then on. They were losing matches that were there to be won and drawing matches that could have gone their way. Now, here's the thing. If you're expecting me to say that Blackburn were doing any better, I can't, because it wouldn't be true. They were also dropping points that they had no business dropping if they had real title aspirations. However, as I said, their early form was carrying them through. In the 5 games leading up to the final game of the season, Blackburn had won 2 games overall, with 2 losses and a draw. United, on the other hand, woke up late and went undefeated with 5 wins in the 7 leading up to the final game. It really goes to show that every single game in the league matters. And we come to the final day. Blackburn on 89 points, Manchester United on 87. It was all set up for a nervy finish. United were away at West Ham and Blackburn were away at Anfield. Both of these games were a must-win for both teams, with fans at each stadium glued to not only the games in front of them, but getting constant radio updates from across the country. And I gotta tell you, man, life works in funny ways because neither team won. In fact, Blackburn lost, and even though Alan Shearer opened the scoring on the final day, John Barnes equalized and Jamie Redknapp broke Rovers' hearts with a belter of a free kick in the 90th minute. 2-1 Liverpool. And this moment right here at Anfield, it may be one of the most confusing atmospheres in Premier League history. The Liverpool players were celebrating their winner on the pitch, while the Blackburn fans were crying tears of joy in the stands. Every single person in that stadium was overjoyed and had a reason to smile. United had drawn to West Ham, and Kenny Dalglish won the Premier League title at Anfield. It's quite the story, you know? The 1994-95 Premier League season was a game of slim margins, but none of that mattered because at the end of the day, Blackburn Rovers were champions. Blackburn Rovers, the team that Jack built, the team that King Kenny led. Blackburn Rovers, only the second team to win the English Premier League. For the first time in 81 years, Rovers had climbed back to the summit of English football. Sadly, they never showed the ambition that got them there ever again. It seemed as though there was no real plan to make sure that there was a smooth succession. Right off the bat, Kenny Dalglish decided that he was done with management for the club and opted to take a position as the director of football. While Dalglish was off playing golf, Ray Harford, his assistant manager who had replaced him, failed to replicate his success. Rovers fell to 7th place. It was also at this point that a mass exodus began to occur. In the next 3 years, they lost Shearer, Lasso, Pearce, Berg, Sherwood, Hendry, and many more. Without the correct leadership and without the correct recruitment, Rovers were unable to keep up with the increasing competition of top-flight English football. Jack Walker wasn't a fan of failure, so the club began playing a game of manager roulette. Between 1991 and 1995, it was just Kenny Dalglish. Between 1995 and 2000, it was Ray Harford, Roy Hodgson, Tony Parks, Brian Kidd, and Graham Souness. They were champions in 1995. They were relegated in 1999, an extremely swift fall from grace. Whatever the plan was, this was certainly not the intended result. And sadly, just 1 year later, terrible news. After a fight with cancer, Jack Walker had passed on at the age of 71. The club wasn't in the greatest of places. There was a resurgence in the following year though, promotion back to the Premier League and a League Cup win in 2002. Blackburn was slowly building their way back into prominence and established themselves as mid-table in the league for the next 11 years, which I would say is a huge win. This was historically their level before the Walker era in the First Division, and the fact that they were able to do this as the more traditionally successful clubs and Chelsea were spending more and more says a lot more about the fight that this team has. It should also be noted that in Walker's final hours, he put in place mechanisms that would ensure that Rovers remained competitive for the foreseeable future. A number of years ago, I put in place a family trust structure to own my various business interests, including Blackburn Rovers. This structure ensures continuity of management and provides the necessary financial support for all my businesses for the foreseeable future. In the years that followed, the Walker Family Trust put about £3 million into the club per year. And by 2005, Walker had been responsible for putting roughly £100 million of his own money into the club, interest-free. Even in death, he looked after this club more than 99.9% of owners ever could while they breathe. However, by 2007, everything changed. The trust seized their donations, the reasoning being that they believed the new influx of Premier League TV revenue would more than cover any investments they had to make to keep the club afloat. It was also made public that Rovers were in the market for investors to help the club move forward in the post-Walker era. This search led them to the Venkateshwara Hatcheries Group, or just Venkies, owners of an Indian poultry and pharmaceutical multinational conglomerate. For £43 million, the club was theirs in November of 2010. The higher-ups of the club were likely hoping to land a passionate fan of football that was focused on nothing but success for Blackburn. And at times, it has seemed as though they have the club's best interests at heart. They have put money into the club, and the football has been free-flowing at times, but there is a lack of fan engagement and overall care on their part. They seem to run the club from India and have kept the fans in the dark over several years. Almost immediately upon their takeover, Blackburn were relegated to the Championship and then again to League One in 2017. They came back up in 2018, but they have remained in the Championship ever since. As you can tell, I skipped over a lot of detail because the decline of Blackburn Rovers is a very, very complicated affair. One that has several twists and turns, and one that certainly can't be explained in a single video. Plus, this video is already the longest video I've ever made. Having said that, I think we still have time for just one more chapter. The major consensus here is that the blame for Blackburn's fortunes post-95 are sat on the shoulders of A, the Walker Trust, and B, the Venky's. The legacy of the man in the center remains intact. There were seemingly two sides to Jack Walker. The side that Blackburn supporters and those who love a good story saw, and the side that many onlookers disgusted by the growing influx of money into the sports saw. There's an article by The Independent that I came across that profiled Jack Walker. Written in 1992, it came out as the country was beginning to take notice at what he was doing in that small town up north. His aim is to buy success for Blackburn Rovers no matter the cost to himself, and his critics say, to the future of an industry that can ill afford to let him send transfer fees through the roof. If he succeeds and Rovers eventually start to win trophies, he will not be found riding open-top buses or appearing in team pictures. Jack Walker opens his wallet more often than his heart. It tells you all you need to know about public sentiment. I couldn't find any team open-air bus photos, but he certainly appeared in his fair share of team photos. Plus, as I noted earlier, the fees he was paying, apart from 2 players, were largely in line with the going rate that other clubs were paying. This is a man that went out and built a wildly successful life through what I can imagine was nothing but grit. He dedicated £100 million that we know of to his boyhood club and asked for nothing in return. Every single person watching this video wishes they could do something similar. If you think you are outclassed, you are. You've got to think high to rise. You've got to be sure of yourself before you can win a prize. Life's battles don't always go to the stronger or faster man, but soon or late, the man who wins is the fellow who thinks he can. This quote was hung upon the wall in Walker's office in Jersey. I'd wager that this is a fair insight to his true mentality. If you take a quick glance at the Blackburn Rovers badge, among the bright colors and the red rose, you'll see a Latin phrase that reads arte et labore. This directly translates to by skill and by labor. And this is because Blackburn is, at its core, an industrial town. Cotton textiles, steel, and more. Skill and labor, the pillars that built this town into what it is. Jack Walker was the embodiment of that, an entrepreneurial spirit and undoubtedly the biggest and most influential legend in the history of Blackburn Rovers. None of what I've spoken about in this video would have been possible without this man. And with that, I leave you with yet another quote. This one is by Jack Straw, the Home Secretary and Blackburn's Labour MP. Jack Walker did more than any other individual in the last century to enhance the self-confidence and the prosperity of his hometown. He was completely committed to the town and its people. And there we have it. Let me know what you guys think about Blackburn. Hope you guys enjoyed. Hope you're having a great day. Cheers, and I will catch you in the next one.